When my dad started chemotherapy, I'm not even joking, but the doctor gave me a pamphlet about colon cancer. And I got up, I'm like, I think you've given me a mistake. My dad is doing this chemotherapy, but why are you giving me information about colon cancer? And he's like, well, that's all we have. On November 15th, 2013, my dad went to the ER because he had gastric bleeding and he had persistent heartburn. He was super nervous because his brother had died of stomach cancer before. So when he went to the hospital, he had already Googled his symptoms and he knew it was not good. They did all kinds of tests. They did an endoscopy and a colonoscopy. And I remember him looking at the GI doctor and he said, "Do I have stomach cancer?" And the GI doctor said, "No." He ended up being dismissed from the hospital. He was discharged with diverticulitis. I followed up by calling the hospital 10 days later for the biopsy results, and they said that my dad did not have cancer. So I was so scared because this was such a scary incident for the whole family that I scheduled a follow-up visit with this primary care doctor, and they asked if I wanted to do a follow-up to the hospital visit or if I wanted to do a physical. And so I ended up doing a physical for my father because I thought, let's just, see if let's just make sure everything is okay. That day, I ended up calling my dad thinking, oh, he's going to be so angry at me because I scheduled a physical without telling him. And I called him and I said, "How are you doing, Dad?" He's like, "Oh, it's not good." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Why wasn't it good? I'm sorry that I had to do this to you." And he's like, "Well, Aki, I have cancer." And at that moment, my whole world just kind of fell apart. I was like, what? When my dad finally got his diagnosis of stomach cancer, we went back to that same GI doctor who had told him it was not cancer. And we're like, what the heck? These pathology reports that show stomach cancer, but you said no cancer. So my dad ended up having another scope, and then he had some CT scans, and we were able to confirm that he had cancer. But initially, my dad's entire medical team, it was at the local community hospital, they really didn't understand what was happening. So we were getting conflicting recommendations, and it was very, very hard. One doctor would say, "Oh, you're definitely stage 4, you're not even eligible for surgery." And another doctor would say, "No, you're early stage because I didn't think it was cancer." And another doctor was like, "Oh, you should do chemotherapy." So we were just so confused. It felt like every single appointment we were just getting bad news after bad news. I finally was able to get him into an NCI institution, which is like 20 miles up the road from us. And at that point, finally, my dad we finally heard that my dad had a potential for a cure. And that was like so relieving. And we were so happy. And the whole team was just on board. So we ended up going with the second opinion doctors. He had a surgeon and he had a oncologist. And because my dad had gastric bleeding, they decided that they were going to remove his stomach first, and then he would follow up with oncology treatment. During the surgery, they decided that he was going to remove the entire stomach. He spent 10 days in the hospital, and after that, he was going to, they finally staged him as stage 3B. His tumor was 7.5 centimeters, and he had, I can't remember at this time, it was between 3 to 6 lymph nodes involvements. But they also found something very interesting. They found that my dad had a biomarker called HER2, and my dad's oncologist ended up submitting into insurance to get that targeted therapy from my father, which he did for a year. So altogether, my dad did 6 cycles of chemotherapy. He did 1 year of targeted therapy, and he did 25 daily radiations to the area. One thing that was really difficult was the chemotherapy caused a lot of side effects for my father. He lost a lot of his teeth. They just kind of broke right in half during chemotherapy, and he couldn't do anything about it because you're doing chemotherapy, your body is just you can't get your teeth extracted. So he had to live with like 12 teeth just completely broken in half. He was put on a medication that gave him a black box side effect. So he has this involuntary tic that we didn't notice at the time, but now we were just really lucky that it didn't turn into Parkinson's disease. Chemotherapy was a really tough time for my dad. So when we had that checkpoint, like, what do you want to do? Do you want to go on to do radiation, or do you want to continue chemotherapy? My dad's like, I want to do radiation. Radiation for my dad was actually harder. If we could go back in time, we would maybe reconsider that decision, because radiation is just like getting all the areas where they're not able to get clean margins around the tumor, and they were hitting that, and my dad lost. It's just like a punch to the gut, and it's every single day, 10 minutes. And finally, after a couple of weeks, my dad was just, his whole intestines, his whole stomach area was so inflamed. He really couldn't eat, he couldn't drink, he was just really miserable. And then they accidentally hit his pancreas. So now his pancreas is insufficient for life, and that is just irreversible. You can't change that. So that was tough. Now, the targeted therapy was probably the easiest treatment that my dad did. He did it for a year. He did it for every 2 weeks, and it had very minimal side effects. So the day that the doctor came in and said, Mr. Shigeo Tsuruoka, your treatment is over, we cried. It was very, very, this is just not the way we foresaw things. I mean, it's just like, what? My dad has like a 90% chance of having a reoccurrence, and this is over? Like, my dad's treatment is over? It was crazy. I even brought like my husband, like the whole family for that meeting when we knew that his treatment was coming to end. I mean, it was just an awful experience. When the first doctor told us that my dad had 6 months to live, I mean, all I could really do is cry. I mean, I was so lost. I didn't know, it's like, I'm an only child, and losing my father so close to my marriage, I was just gutted and devastated. And I said, okay, if I can figure this out, if my dad can survive his prognosis, I'm going to give back. And so that's what I did. In 2016, I started Hope for Stomach Cancer, not because not for my dad. I don't seek advice or recommendations on my dad's care. We had already figured it out. By 2016, my dad was in remission. He was doing well. So I really didn't need any advice or guidance for him. But I still remember just all that time being lost. When my dad started chemotherapy, I'm not even joking, but the doctor gave me a pamphlet about colon cancer. And I'm like, I got up, I'm like, I think you've given me a mistake. My dad is doing this chemotherapy, but why are you giving me information about colon cancer? And he's like, well, that's all we have. And I was at an NCI institution in 2014. So, I mean, like, really, that's all you have? My dad is a stomach cancer patient, and you're giving me information about colon cancer? So I really wanted something for patients and caregivers such as myself to help navigate through their disease, and that's what we're doing. And I'm so proud. I'm so proud of Hope for Stomach Cancer, where we've grown. We started in 2016, and now it's 2023. And the pipeline for stomach cancer options and treatments have expanded. At that time, there was just 1 or 2 chemotherapies that you could do as a stage 3-4 patient, and now there are three options. But I mean, for first line, for second line, there's a lot more, and there's a lot of things happening in the pipeline with clinical trials. And I feel like one day we're going to get to this point where we're not going to say to patients anymore, hey, you have 6 months to live. We're going to say, hey, we can manage this as a disease or a chronic disease. Or one day we're going to hear the words cure. Like, all stages, we're going to say, hey, we have a cure. Whenever somebody says, what's your plan for Hope for Stomach Cancer in the next 5 years? And I honestly really hope that in the next 5 years, I could say, we're done. We closed our nonprofit. We've put a lot of people out of business, a lot of oncologists, a lot of surgeons out of business. We found the cure, and we're done. And now we could just go on and live our lives. That's kind of my hope, my advice.